Hey everyone, welcome to the video. In this video, I want to talk about balancing discipline and open-mindedness. When you think of discipline, you can associate it with order, with routine and habit, and the instinct that we have for predictability and stability. Someone who's disciplined usually keeps their promises. They have the same behaviors that they do over and over again, whether it's in the gym or whether it's for their academic pursuits or whether it's in their job. Someone who's disciplined has a structured mindset, and they tend not to deviate from that path, assuming that what's worked for them in the past, their routines and their habits, are continuing to work for them. Now, someone who's open minded would be a little more flexible. They would be spontaneous. They would, to a very large degree, prefer novelty and maybe even feel aversive towards conforming to the normal ways of doing things or adhering to the suggestions and expectations of the average person or perhaps of the consensus that has been laid out in society. And so people who are open are more creative. And from a personality perspective, discipline and open-mindedness can be associated with the Big Five paradigm, where you have conscientiousness, which is associated with orderliness and industriousness, perhaps another word for discipline. And then you have openness to experience, which is another personality trait that's associated with aesthetics and intellectual conversations and creativity. Both discipline and open-mindedness have positive and negative aspects. In my mind, this framework of discipline and openness aligns with Jordan Peterson's balancing of order and chaos, which is why I really like this idea of discipline and openness. It seems to slot nicely into that Jungian framework. Discipline, like order, is helpful and it's positive because it gives you predictability and stability at many levels of analysis. It enables you to be protected and it reduces your levels of anxiety at the psychological and sociological levels. From a cultural perspective, from a societal perspective, imagine if every time you met someone you had to, from scratch, figure out how to interact with them. For the average person, right now I live in New York, when you pass by a stranger, you don't say anything. But imagine if you didn't have that societal expectation that when you pass someone on the street, you don't stare at them, you don't attack them, you don't try to steal something from them. And obviously that still happens. But the norm and the expectation is that when you encounter a stranger, they are not a threat and they are not a danger to you, or else you would act that way. So discipline and order and adhering to expectations is helpful in that it reduces the information processing that we have to do given all of the complexity in our environment, in both the physical and social environment. But it's negative, or at least it can be negative, when discipline and order becomes too rigid, when the individual cannot break out of their routine, even if their routine is maladaptive. And we could think about this in terms of addiction, but we could also think about it in terms of something a little more subtle. Jean Piaget was a developmental psychologist, and he believed that optimal adaptation, which he called equilibration, was manifested when the child, the individual, assimilated and adapted to the world. So assimilation is attending to the world using your knowledge structures that you've already established. And so according to Piaget, we have all these different knowledge structures or schemas, things like sensory motor schemas like grabbing or throwing or kicking. And then from those sensory motor schemas, we build more elaborate and abstract schemas and knowledge structures. And so just the expectation that when you see someone, you say hello. When you see someone familiar, you greet them. Or when you see a stranger, you keep walking. Or when you're at the train station and the train comes and you get on the train, all of the knowledge that it takes for you to express those behaviors, you could think of those as schemas. And assimilation means to view the world in terms of your already established schemas. In reality, you can imagine that as time goes on, every new experience you're having every second is new. However, to the degree that you are a fully functioning adult who has normally developed, you treat everything as if it's always the same to a very large degree. You can associate assimilation with discipline and order. You wake up and you go throughout your day as if, for the most part, things are the same, such that the knowledge structures that you already have are good enough. An example could simply just be someone who is trying to get fit in the gym. You wake up and you go to the gym and you have all these different knowledge structures about how to get to the gym and how to work out and how to do these specific lifts for however many reps and how to leave the gym. All of these different knowledge structures are things that you have built up through your experience and through your interactions with the environment. And to the degree that nothing really changes in the environment, then what you've learned in the past is good enough to get you through the current experience. And so you can think about assimilation as discipline. Now, the negative part of discipline can manifest when you are only assimilating and you don't do the other part of the adaptive equilibrium that Piaget discussed, which was accommodation. And accommodation manifests when you encounter something that's new in the world and your knowledge structures are not sufficient enough for you to deal with it. So you deal with something that is completely novel to you. And accommodation is the modification or generation of new knowledge structures, so that way you can overcome that new obstacle, that new social interaction, that new project at work, whatever it is that you're dealing with that makes you anxious or makes you nervous. And some people potentially who are too disciplined, who are too conscientious perhaps, they're so focused on what they already know that they struggle to update themselves and they struggle to accommodate, which again, Piaget believed was the real form of adaptation. It was a balance between assimilation and accommodation. So discipline has its positives in that it's predictive, it enables stability, you don't have to worry about too many things, you just do your routines and do your habits. And as long as the world stays relatively simple from your perspective, from your experiential standpoint, things are fine. But it's when the environment changes to over a certain threshold that you're then put in the position to learn or to suffer because you're dealing with something that you just have no idea how to contend with. So those are the positives and negatives of discipline and assimilation. We already touched on accommodation, which we can associate with open-mindedness. The proclivity to generate new forms of knowledge or new ideas about how to think about people, how to think about culture, how to deal with the various problems at your job, and how to navigate certain social interactions. Openness and accommodation also have their positives and negatives. It's good to be open-minded and to be flexible, so that way you are open to taking in new information from the environment, so that way you can learn, you can update yourself, and that way you can pass on that knowledge to your kids or whoever it is that you're involved with that may deal with those same problems in the future. And so being open so that way you can learn is good. At the same time, if you are too open, then what can happen is that you lose predictability. You lose stability, particularly in your social environment. If you are so open, let's say with your identity, that other people can't perceive you as a unified being that's consistent across time, from their perspective, you are an anxiety-provoking stimulus. If every time they meet you, you go by a different name, let's say, or you respond emotionally to the same stimulus differently throughout the day or throughout the week. If people can't predict you, then it's very difficult for them to get a hold on you, and they will actually likely avoid you. When it comes to just learning in general, if you're too open, then you never build knowledge structures or foundational structures that enable you to contend with the problems that you will still face every day, but that you know how to deal with. Let's try to give an example there. Going back to the gym. So me, for example, I'm trying to get stronger in the gym. And so I'm trying to build muscle, particularly with my upper body. And I have these knowledge structures. I have this discipline about reps and sets for certain exercises, for benching, for military press, for pull-ups, for weighted dips. And I know that if I want to get better and get stronger in the gym, I have to do progressive overload with these same workouts and get better in terms of form, in terms of working volume with these same exercises. If I'm too open, well, then I never build the physical and psychological knowledge structures for doing those specific exercises. I never get the time to familiarize myself with bench press, for example, and build that muscle memory so that way I can do the proper form with this exercise and over the weeks and months add weight, which adds a little bit of novelty, and I might have to adjust my form, but you need a solid foundation off of which you can then go be creative and be open. But if you're nothing but openness, well, then imagine that I would go into the gym every day and, sometimes I work out 15 minutes, sometimes I work out for 2 hours, and sometimes I do bench, and sometimes I do dips, and sometimes I do tricep extensions, but I never do the same workout, and I never spend time doing the same thing or even having the same goal of increasing my weight and building that strength. So with anything you do, whether it's fitness, academic pursuits, or your job, you need a form of discipline, such as the same habits, the same ways of thinking that are the same goals as well, that are your base. Okay? Imagine you're trying to build a house, right? You need a shape, you need strong walls, you need a strong foundation, but within that house, you have the freedom to play. And I think that's one of the ways that Piaget might frame how it is you balance your old habits and your old ways of thinking with potentially novel ways of thinking, given a problem that's new enough that you haven't contended with before. And pulling from Carl Jung, I think that a lot of suffering psychologically in intimate relationships and in our culture can manifest when we are too one-sided. So Jung thought that the psyche consisted of many opposing principles or many opposing elements. You could think of it as emotion on the one hand or rationality on the other hand. And then another set of opposites would be consciousness versus the unconscious. And then another set of opposites would be, embodiment versus abstraction. For Jung, all of those things were within the psyche and they were in a necessary tension with each other. And so if you became too emotional and you disregarded your rationality and your ability to reasonably think about things, that could be a form of, I don't want to say psychopathology, but a form of suffering. But the same thing would occur if you went too far in the other direction and you lost all of your emotionality and you were completely rational and reasonable, although, humans can't be like that, but you understand the point, hopefully. For Jung, there was a balance that needed to be found between these different constituent elements of your psyche. And I think that the principle of there being a necessary tension between discipline and openness is a reflection of the same thing that Jung was saying, as well as a reflection of the same developmental pattern that Piaget was asserting. And so this is something that people can think about for themselves. You can ask yourself, are you too open? Are you too flexible, too impulsive? And do you need a little bit of discipline? And you can ask yourself, well, are you too boring? Are you too rigid? Are you too constrained by your old habits and your old ways of thinking, that you're not taking in enough new information to update yourself. And one of the ways that you can check in your own life, if you're being honest with yourself, is to identify the goals that you have. If you have goals, that's the first problem. Maybe you don't have goals. But if you have goals, have a realistic check on your progress towards those goals. And if you aren't making progress towards those goals, then maybe you aren't as balanced as you need to be. And maybe you need to be a little more disciplined. Or maybe you've been doing the same thing in the gym for years and you're not making any progress. And so now you need to accommodate taking that new information, like, oh, I'm actually not fulfilling my goals as the days are and weeks and months are progressing. So what's going on? What do I need to change? And then you can accommodate and be a little more open-minded. And so that's something that can be helpful. And it can also be helpful in relationships. One tension that could potentially manifest in relationships is that one individual is too disciplined and the other individual is too open-minded. And so one individual might prefer predictability and doing the same things over and over again, every day, every week. And another person might want to be more spontaneous and to go out and to not have a plan and to not have structure in the shared life of the relationship. This can be a point of conflict, and it's helpful to realize that about yourself. Let's say if you're in an intimate relationship, but also it's helpful to realize that about your partner, and how too much of one thing can lead to problems, and also not being able to have the words to formulate and to articulate the nature of the tension in the relationship. That can also be a problem. So I think I'm going to end the video there. There's a necessary tension between discipline and open-mindedness that leads to better outcomes compared to being too one-sided in either direction. And it can be helpful to try to understand within yourself, where do you fall along that spectrum? And one of the ways that you can find meaning in your life is trying to develop your own personality. And that's one trajectory that you can discover. You can say to yourself that maybe I'm too disciplined and I'm too rigid and I need some innovation and some ingenuity. Or you could say that I'm undisciplined and I'm all over the place and I need some structure. So how can I go get that other part of my personality that I'm lacking? And once you have that question, let's just say that opportunities will open up to you once you ask the right question. Gonna end the video there. Thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.